This morning, we are beginning a series on contentment. We're going to be looking at biblical contentment over the next few weeks leading up to the Christmas season. I can't believe it's already the Christmas season. I don't know if y'all feel that way. I heard a Christmas song on the radio the other day, and it seems like we just celebrated Christmas. But looking forward to this season in our church. So, excited for you to be here. If you want to turn in your Bibles, we're going to be looking at 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. We're going to be looking specifically at verses 6 through 10. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 6 through 10, on this idea of the great gain of godliness with contentment. The great gain of godliness with contentment. As we're thinking about that, I would just love to get your basic response here. If someone were to come to you and say, "Listen, I have a foolproof investment strategy that guarantees great gain," what would your first thought be? Scam. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. That's what, 930 agreed. If somebody came to you and said, I can guarantee a way for you to enjoy and possess great gain, you would go, what's the catch? You're going to take all my money. I know that's going to happen. But God does tell us in his word that there is great gain, but it's not the great gain that our world points us to. It is godliness with contentment, which we're going to look at this morning. And so I want to encourage you to stand with me out of respect for the reading of the Word of God. We're going to be in 1 Timothy chapter 6, looking at verses 6 through 10. This is what God's Word says. "But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to be rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." May the Lord bless the study and the reading of his word. You may be seated as we go to him in prayer. Father, I pray that you would help me and help our people, your people, Lord, as we reflect upon what it means to be content, Lord, in a pursuit of godliness. Lord, I pray that you would, Lord, rescue us and deliver us, Lord, from the lies that our society tells us. Lord, and that we would hear you speak through your word. Guard me from error, Lord. Bless your people. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. So, contentment's kind of an interesting thing. Contentment is something that I think most people would agree is a good thing to have, but we live in a society constantly surrounded by advertisers and marketing strategies where contentment does not help sell things, right? I mean, when was the last time that you saw an ad on Instagram or Facebook, or you got a flyer in the mail and it said, "Be happy with what you have"? That marketing director would be fired. But God calls us to be deeply content with his provision for us. And it's a sign of his love toward us that he does this, because he seeks to deliver us from the desires of our flesh that would lead us astray from such contentment, such godliness. And so we're going to break this passage up into two parts. We're going to look at verses 6 through 8 and then verses 9 through 10 and see this great gain of godliness with contentment, and then a warning that Paul gives all of us regarding the desires of our hearts. So if you're taking notes and you want to have the first point in here, you could say, the great gain of godliness with contentment in verses 6 through 8. So let's begin looking at verse 6. "But godliness with contentment is great gain, What is Paul doing here? One of the things that we see Paul doing is when he begins a verse with the word like but, he's making a contrast to some of the material that he has mentioned in the previous verses. So you could take verse 6 as a positive reflection that is responding to the negative examples that he's mentioned in verses 1 through 5. And we won't read verses 1 through 5. We've got a good bit to get through here in the verses that we have. But what we need to reflect upon is what was happening in Ephesus, where Timothy was, where Paul had spent time, and what he's addressing there. According to verses 1 through 5, Ephesus was being infiltrated by false teachers that believed that godliness is a means to financial gain. That was essentially what they were teaching. The idea of godliness in these verses is devotion to God. You could even describe it as good deeds or good works. And it's important here that we recognize that while Paul and all of Scripture preaches the good news of salvation as being by grace through faith, not of ourselves, lest we boast, that does not mean that the faith that saves us does not then also demonstrate itself in the fruits of good deeds. When we are saved by Christ through faith, it produces within us a new life, and that new life is reflected in the way that we live. So, we don't want to get things twisted this morning. Good works don't save us, but good works do accompany salvation. You say, well, where is that taught in this passage? Well, it's not explicitly taught here in 1 Timothy, but in these same types of pastoral epistles, Paul wrote to a man named Titus. And I want you to hear what he says in Titus chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Thinking about this relationship between faith in the gospel of Christ and good deeds. Paul writes, he says, Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ, this is why he's writing, to further the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth. And then he goes on to say this, that leads to godliness. Faith, the faith of God's elect, and their knowledge of the truth should what? Lead to godliness. And so when a person puts their faith in Christ and he changes their heart by the work of the Holy Spirit, it ought to lead to godliness. So a good question to ask ourselves, especially as we near the end of a year and we start to make plans for a new year, we do these types of things, is we kind of ought to ask questions like, from January 1 to December 31st this year, have I seen progress in this growth in godliness? Am I growing more devoted to the Lord, and even in the deeds that I do that God's word would call good? And so what was happening in Ephesus is some people were saying you ought to do good things so that you would have financial gain. And Paul says that's not the motivation. We shouldn't be motivated to do good things so that we get things. We ought to be motivated to do things because our hearts, our affections have changed. The faith of God's people and their knowledge of the truth, which is the message of the gospel that Paul preached, leads to godliness. Faith in Christ leads to godliness, which is a life of devotion to God. And it's a life that will be filled with good works that accord with God's righteousness. But what was happening in Ephesus was the motivation was not on reflecting God's righteousness, but getting paid. I don't know exactly how that worked. I have a feeling that those false teachers were the ones getting paid. It's funny how that happens, right? But these false teachers were going in Ephesus and they were disrupting the people's faith. They were disrupting the church. And so Paul wants to address this. Now, I do want to make just a brief note about false teachers here that's really helpful for us to have an awareness about. One is that they rarely announce their intentions at the beginning, right? A few weeks, maybe a month ago, Hannah got a funny phone call, and it left a voicemail. And it was a deputy from the constable's office and we needed to call immediately. Otherwise, they were going to come and like arrest the whole family or something like that, which obviously is not how that type of thing normally works. But just to make sure, I called the sheriff's office, and I can't remember the deputy's fake name, but I called the office and I said, hey, I just got a phone call, or my wife just got a phone call, and they said it's this. It said it's deputy, and she stopped me and she finished his name. And she said, oh yeah, that's a scam. You don't have to worry about anything. So that was encouraging to hear. It also meant for the next several days, I tried to make as many prank phone calls as I could to that number, but he never answered. But he did not announce, oh, by the way, I'm trying to scam you. False teachers don't do that. In fact, much like that scammer that called us, false teachers do the same thing. They use the language. You know, he was a deputy at the constable's office and all these things, like gave his badge number, just they use the language to draw you in. That's what these false teachers were doing in Ephesus. They likely used Jesus' name. They probably said things that were actually right, but with that kernel of truth, they would sneak in the poison of falsehood. And in this situation, it was this falsehood that we ought to be godly in order that we would be financially blessed. This is not what motivates the Christian. Godliness with contentment is great gain. It's interesting that Paul does not say here that godliness with contentment will lead to great gain. No, he equates godliness with contentment as the great gain. So what is the great gain? Being content with what God has provided us while pursuing and being devoted to Him. How is that a gain, though? Why is it that that would be something that we ought to be grateful for? Paul goes on to explain why this is great gain, because of what it frees us from. It frees us from the bondage that we often feel, or the slavery that we can feel, to things, to the different possessions and the things that we have in this world. And Paul makes an interesting comment here in verse 7 that one scholar goes on to summarize as this: we will die just as we were born, without any material possessions. This is likely drawn from a few different passages in the Old Testament. Job 1:21, Job says, naked I came from the womb, naked I shall return. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Also, you find it in places like Psalm 49:17. But I particularly like Ecclesiastes 5:15, which Paul is likely drawing on. Ecclesiastes 5:15 says, everyone comes naked from their mother's womb, and as everyone comes, so they will depart. They take nothing from their toil that they can carry in their hands. And at this point, some of you that have been around church long enough are already hearing the cliche that I'm going to use anyways because it's true. I'm this close to saying, now say it with me, but I don't know, maybe not. But you've seen it, maybe you've seen it on a bumper sticker, but it's true. There are no U-Hauls behind hearses. We don't take with us all the things that we work for in this life. Now, I know there is a picture out there of a hearse that's pulling a U-Haul, but you get the point, all right? That was a hearse that had been repurposed for something, so don't bring that picture up to me afterwards and go, well, actually, Pastor, you know what I'm saying, is that the things that we set our affections upon oftentimes in this world are not permanent things. And Paul is wanting to drive home how these things that we put our hope in and we work so hard for, they do not last. We will leave this world as we came into it regarding material possessions. That's heavy to hear. I'm going to put an even finer point on it. Because I think that there are even times when we have such a relationship to our material possessions that we think, yes, but people after me will get to enjoy them. Let me disabuse you of that misperception. many of the things that you think are so wonderful and treasured, like they are really important to you, within days, maybe a few weeks after you die, your family is going to go through those. They will keep a few. They will disperse a few. They will sell the rest of it at an estate sale. And then whatever doesn't sell at the estate sale, they're going to donate. Paul is trying to break through this illusion that the things that we possess have eternal significance. They're temporary, they're fleeting. And he doesn't want us to be captured and held by these things. First, Jesus taught us in a passage we're going to look at in a few weeks, in Luke chapter 12, verse 15, life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. So here Paul is stressing the temporality of the things of this world. Instead of pursuing godliness with the mistaken idea that it leads to financial gain, we should realize that godliness with contentment is great gain in and of itself, because contentment with what God has provided us frees us from the endless pursuit of things that will not last. So then, what should we be content with, Paul? He goes on to tell us in verse 8. If you have food and clothing, be content with that. What is that referring to? It's kind of helpful. Food would include water, obviously. It's not like you can just eat and not drink anything. He's using that kind of, it's just a collective. We need nourishment. And then he says clothing, and your first thought is like, what about shelter? He uses a Greek word here that actually has this idea of covering, which probably got this dual sense of clothing and covering, or clothing and shelter. So if we were going to ask Paul, what are the necessities of life, the things that we have to have? Food, water, clothing, shelter. It's a pretty simple life. If those are the things that are necessities, many other things are just luxuries. I love what John R.W. Stott wrote on this passage in thinking about Paul's own life and the life he calls us to. Stott writes, "We brought nothing with us and can take nothing away with us." I was struck by this comment. He says, as the officiating minister said at the funeral of a wealthy lady, when asked by the curious how much she had left. So you get the picture, right? Minister preaches, and everybody wants to know, how much did she leave behind? And he says, she left everything. Everything. You get the point. It is perspective which should influence our economic lifestyle, for possessions are only the traveling luggage of time. They are not the stuff of eternity. It would be sensible, therefore, to travel light and, as Jesus himself commanded us, not to store up for ourselves, that is, to accumulate selfishly treasures on earth. Luxuries are not essential to Christian contentment, but necessities are. For Paul, we should embrace a simple lifestyle. We ought to be able to discern the difference between a necessity of life and a luxury of life. We ought to regard possessions as tools to be used to accomplish God's purposes, but not treasures in and of themselves. Herein lies contentment for the Christian, being satisfied with what God has provided, that we might recognize that we are living for eternity, not an abundance of things. Now, I want to be real clear about two things here, because sometimes people hear teaching about this and they come away with some false understandings of what I'm saying or what other preachers are saying in this regard. The first thing that I need to mention here is that Paul is not promoting or endorsing poverty. Poverty is an awful thing, and hundreds of millions of people struggle with poverty, and that is not having clean water, having food, having clothing, having shelter. That is not a good thing. And in fact, as God blesses his people, our default ought to be to use our abundance to help alleviate those pains and those struggles. Poverty, Paul is not saying just be poor. That's not his point here. He is reinforcing the idea that there are things that we do need in life and there's things that we don't actually need. And when it is within our ability to address these needs, we ought to do so. And so obviously, there is a degree to which possessing some abundance helps us be able to meet the needs of others. So important here. Don't walk away and go, oh, that was just one of those poverty theology sermons. It wasn't. That was not the point. Paul is actually dealing with something far more uncomfortable than for all of us. He's dealing with our heart's disposition in these things. But another thing that I want to make clear is not only is he not promoting poverty, he is also not saying that we should not enjoy the possessions that God has blessed us with. And that's clear just from the rest of of chapter 6. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17, Paul tells Timothy to warn those who are rich in the present age not to be haughty nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us all things richly to enjoy. It's interesting here that he does not command those that are rich to divest themselves of all their riches, but rather to use those riches to do good to others. Sometimes people will picture the early church as just everyone was poor. No, that's not actually the case. Oftentimes, a few different things happen. One is that they met in homes that had to be large enough at times to accommodate a lot of people. So there were obviously some people within the context of the church that had wealth, but how were they using it? Another aspect of it is many times the epistles that we see, like Romans and 1 Timothy, things like that, many times those were sponsored by somebody that was particularly wealthy in that context of that church, and they would pay for it to be professionally written. That's why you see some names at the ends of those letters thanking people for that. And so again, Paul is not saying we ought to try to be poor, nor is he saying that by virtue of having something you are in sin. He's not saying either of those things. What he's saying instead is that the disposition of our life ought to be one of satisfaction with the Lord so that we could be like Paul in Philippians 2 to say, I know this secret, which we're going to look at next week, how to be abased and how to abound. So I can do all things through Christ who lives in me. That he has a rightly ordered relationship with the things that God has blessed him with. So when we are blessed with an abundance, that does not mean that we are not free to enjoy those blessings, but rather that we ought to discern how God desires for us to use these blessings to be a blessing to others. As Christians, I love this imagery. We are conduits. You know what conduit is? Some of you do. Some of you may not know what it is. Conduit is just that PVC or sometimes iron rod that all kinds of things can go through, typically wire, electrical wire, things like that, where it safeguards it. And so the conduit itself is not the most important part. It's providing through the one who's provided for us. So we're conduits of blessing to others. So when we think through what we truly need in this life, we need to recognize how God has freed us in Christ to care for others. This is the great gain of godliness with contentment. Freedom from bondage to stuff to make us happy in life. Freedom to live to prove that Jesus is better than life itself, as Dr. John Piper has said. What's interesting, though, is that Paul is aware of the fact that this message is probably not going to be well received by everyone. As you can imagine, this would not be a popular message here in the United States. And so Paul wants to make sure that those that would desire and love the pursuit of wealth hear a very important warning, which brings us to the second part of this message in verses 9 through 10, a warning for those who desire to be rich. Paul writes, "Those who want to be rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction." This is a powerful verse. It's powerful in the sense that he's warning a particular group of people, those that have this desire, those who want to be rich. And again, I would want to highlight, he is dealing with the matters and the motivations of the heart. This warning can apply to anyone, rich or poor, who desires more than they truly need, regardless of whether they already possess it. This group of people are guilty of what Paul would call, and we see elsewhere in Scripture, being covetous. That is, the guiltiness of wanting and desiring instead of being content. As an example of this, I would just encourage you to make note of a passage like James 4, 1 through 3, where James talks about the misplaced motives of asking the Lord to give, so that instead of using it to bless others, we would use it for our own pleasures. The issue here is contentment with God's provision, being satisfied with what God has allowed us to possess and enjoy. And you may think, well, but what's so bad about a desire? And so you're thinking that's not as bad as having it. I mean, if you wanted to kill somebody, that would be bad. Killing someone would seem to be substantively worse, though, right? There's different levels within our judicial system, and so, but of course, Jesus elevates that and says, anyone who's looked at his brother with hate in his heart, he's already guilty of murder. But I think we tend to think that our desires are not problematic. Like it's not an issue that I need to address. I'll deal with the issue whenever the behavior is there. And so Paul uses this progression here in verses 9 and 10. Those who desire to be rich, to get rich, fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. There's this threefold progression we see here, from temptation to entrapment to destruction. And we play fast and loose with the desires because we're not trapped yet. But Paul wants us to be aware of the fact that these desires they're not neutral, and they can lead to very bad, difficult places. Now, I've told some people this story, and you have to forgive me if I've already told you this story. Maybe some of you follow me on one of the social media places where I posted it. But the Lord must have been wanting me to have a really good example for this move from temptation to entrapment. Not destruction. You'll understand that in the story in a second. So months ago, I was sitting in my office at the house, and I heard some scurrying behind me. We had a Murphy bed. That's a bed that folds into the wall. I didn't build it. It was there. I would have preferred more bookshelves, but they didn't ask me when they built it. I look behind me when all this scurrying is happening, and there is a little possum at the top of the Murphy bed watching me work. Just like, what's going on down there? He jumps down into my office, and I used a golf club. I did not hit him, to kind of move him out of the way until I could get to my garage. And, I kind of panicked there for a second. I was like, I don't know how this got in the house. We'll figure that out later, but he is on the floor in my study right now. So I went and got a small game live trap out of my garage. You're like, why do you have that? If you have a birth certificate from the state of Louisiana, you have to maintain and keep a live small animal trap on you at all times. And so I just went to the garage and got it, brought it back out, put it in the office. So how am I going to get this possum in the trap? Easy. Wet cat food. Opened up a can of wet cat food, that nasty smelling stuff, set it in the trap, opened the trap, walked back out into the living room to finish my coffee, and then didn't kill him again. And there he was, walking to the office. I've got it all on video. Trapped him, and then took him out in the front yard and let him go because possums are good for the environment. Some of you thought I was going to say good to eat, but no, we're not going to go there. Let him go. The rest of the story is he got back into my office again because the Murphy bed had an unfinished hole into the attic. So, yeah, he no longer gets into the house. He does live in the garage, and we have made a peace treaty. He eats a little dog food, doesn't come in the house anymore. We get along. But what was it that made that possum get caught in the trap? The natural desire to want to eat something, right? He smelled it, goes, oh, that smells terrible. I ought to go check that out. And went and crawled him into the trap, got caught. Now, that's the type of image that Paul wants us to see here with the desire for wealth. Is that how quickly it moves from a desire to provide for family, which is right and good. Should want that. A desire for my needs to be met. That's good. That's not a bad desire. And then we kind of let that desire keep creeping, and then it starts to blur a line. And then the next thing we know is it's a desire that's leading us into temptation. And then that temptation then leads us into the trap. But instead of being caught in a trap where we're released, Paul says it's a trap that leads to our destruction. And then he closes this section with a very familiar verse to many, many, many of us, which is the verse that says, I want to make sure that I quote it right because we've all heard it misquoted. We're told, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. What we've typically heard is that money is the root of all evil, which is a misstatement. But he says, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. So again here, he highlights the role of desire. He tells us that it is the love of money that undergirds all sorts of evil actions in our lives and in society, and I'm sure that we could go around for quite some time and point out examples of that in our own society. The love of money leads people into a trap. And we should view it as a mercy for God to deliver us from such endless pursuits of temporary things. Setting your heart on material possessions and money will never lead to the satisfaction and the security that your soul longs for. Jesus would ask us, why lay up treasures for yourself here on earth where thieves break in and moth and rust destroy? Why not lay up treasures for yourself in heaven? Why not invest in godliness with contentment? This is what Jesus has called us to. He has saved us that we might possess real treasure, real satisfaction, real life with him forever. Yet the siren's call, the temptation from society is going to constantly be in your ear saying, there's no way that can be true. That it's truly great gain to be content with godliness. God's word tells us to flee these types of desires and to find our satisfaction, to be content in him. My prayer for us is that through Jesus Christ, God would deliver us from the temptation to find our hope in the things of the world. That we would not put our hope in money or markets, but in Christ, the one who truly satisfies. Would you pray with me? Father, use your word by your Spirit. Do this for your glory and our good. Be magnified. We ask this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.